Okay, so here we're going to get a little more specific to looking at the earnings gap. So we know that difference in human capital levels or education levels will affect earnings. And so if we find that women or a minority group which is disadvantaged in society acquire less human capital or a different type of human capital, this could lead to an earnings gap. So some examples. There is some evidence that women tend to invest more, or at least in the past, more in human capital with non-market returns than men do. So men's choice of, for example, academic majors in the past tended to be more narrowly focused on high-paying majors, and women's tended to be a little bit less focused on that and tended to be a little more focused on things that maybe they found were interesting or things that they thought would be useful to themselves. Also, so this is investing in human capital that increase satisfaction rather than earnings. At this point, I'm sorry about that. At this point, I'm not saying this is the thing. I'm just giving this as a potential example of what I'm talking about. We'll come back to this a little bit later. Okay. Okay. So we can have different levels of human capital, right? It could be a difference in the total amount of education. It could be a difference in the specific fields people would choose. It also could be a difference in the reason for the investment. Are people investing specifically to get monetary gain, or are they investing for these other types of gains, non-monetary gains, otherwise known as non-pecuniary gains? So let's look at 1970. And let's see how much in 1970, how much of the wage gap could be explained by difference in human capital. And just on the rough one, and here we're only looking at the amount because that's all we have. Just on the rough one, we can say some. Okay, because in 1970, for example, 15% of people in the 25 to 64 range, so they're old enough that they're, in many cases, they should be probably out of college. There was 15% of men had 4 or more years of college, but only 9% of women. Okay, and the same advantage was true for some college. So although women were a little less likely to drop out of high school, they were much less likely to have bachelor's degrees. So some of this wage advantage men had, and also advantage in terms of the occupations they were choosing in the managerial and professional, was partly due to this. Okay, now fast forward to 2015. Now it has changed. So now in 2015, actually women are more likely to have a bachelor's degree, and they're also more likely to have some college. And so men are actually have on average that the education level amongst men is lower than the education level for the average woman. One thing to notice, if you're looking at these education levels, is that when we think about our median worker, you have to think, well, where is the 50th percentile? So actually for both groups, the median worker that we see in this data when we compare median workers is actually the median worker with some college. If we compare workers with college, we're going to get a little different answer because that's not the median worker. That's what we could say is probably the upper third of the education distribution. So anyways, while we go to 2015, the total amount of education does not explain as well why women continue to earn less than men. And for that, we'll have to look at other factors, including the specific fields that people are choosing. Okay, so again, this education gap has been closed to some extent. We can also look, just briefly looking at race, we can look that this shows, I show you some old data here. I'll come back and show you some more data in a future class. But we see that this is not new graduates, but the percentage who are college graduates from 1957 to 2009 has been, whites have stayed to have a higher percentage, and the gap is not really closing. So all three groups for white, black, and Hispanic are all going up, but the gap remains large, and it's not really closing very much. Okay, and so again, for differences in salaries between different racial groups and also differences in their occupational distribution, different levels of college attainment can explain at least part of this. They can explain at least part of this. And incidentally, I did not include Asian Americans in this graph, partly because the number is quite high. The data line is very short because there's only good data back to the 90s, but also because the number is very, very high and would be off the chart, and I would have to make the chart much bigger. We'll come back in the end of this section and look more specific current data, because this is old data, more specific current data about education levels for race.